Good evening, good people. There are like 2 hours left of Wednesday, so I figured that we had plenty of time to talk about the hymn of the day for this coming Sunday, like we typically do on Wednesdays. And so the hymn of the day for this Sunday, which is the fifth Sunday in Lent at Grace Lutheran Church, is Lutheran Service Book number 430, and it is "My Song is Love Unknown." And I asked Pastor this week about why he picked this hymn, and he was really honest with me about it. He said it's one of his favorite Lenten hymns, and we're running out of Sundays in Lent. So it doesn't have a direct tie-in to any of the scriptures that we're going to be reading this week in service, but it still does have those penitential or those themes that go with the penitential season of Lent, the reflective season of Lent. So it's still going to be a very fitting hymn for us. So we'll give him a pass on this one. But if you open up in your hymnal to page or to hymn 430, you will see a little bit of information there at the bottom, right, as per usual. We see that the text is written by an Anglican clergyman by the name of Samuel Crossman, and it was written in 1664, and so it's a little bit older than some of the hymns that we've been talking about recently on Wednesdays, but he writes it in 1664 for a booklet that he wrote entitled "The Young Man's Meditation, or Some Few Sacred Poems Upon Select Subjects and Scriptures." So written for a young man's devotional pamphlet that contains 9 sacred poems. So yes, this text is written as a poem, not necessarily as a hymn. As a matter of fact, we don't have it associated with a tune until it appears in a hymnal in like 1870. And remember, it's written in 1664. So not associated with being sung until later in the 19th century. But then once we have it there, we see it appearing in more hymnals over time until we get to 1918. And in 1918, the man who's listed at the bottom of your page in the hymnal, John Ireland, writes this tune that we now pretty much exclusively associate with this text. I have to say that I'm really glad that Ireland wrote it, because I looked at some of the other tunes that had been in use from like 1870 to 1918 earlier today, and I just don't think any of them fit the themes of this hymn so well as Ireland's tune, and I just don't think they're as pretty, and I don't like them as well. So, but that's just my humble opinion. You don't have to agree with me on that. But we do have to admit that Ireland's hymn has now become the most widely used, or Ireland's tune rather, has become the most widely used tune for this text across all traditions. There's still a few hymnals that will use other tunes, but for the most part, we use Ireland's tune. And there's a story associated with Ireland writing the tune. It's said that he was approached in 1918, when he wrote the tune, by the editor of a hymn book for school children, and he approached Ireland to ask him to write a tune for this Crossman poem, this text, "My Song is Love Unknown." And it's said that Ireland, within 15 minutes of receiving that request, scribbled this down and composed this, scribbled it down on a piece of scratch paper. And I don't know if that story's true. The story appears in 1950, which is like 32 years after the hymn was, or the tune was first written, so take it with a grain of salt. But if it is, we have to admit that's super impressive, because his 15-minute scribbles become now the most widely used tune, and what I think is a beautiful tune to associate with this text. I'm going to link a video of the boys choir at Christ College in Cambridge singing this hymn, and you'll recognize it right away as soon as it pops up. So make sure you click on that when you're done watching here. But this hymn is all about a love that is so great that the author calls it a love unknown. It's something that we just can't wrap our minds around or comprehend. And that is, of course, the love of Christ for us, the love that he shows us by the events of course, his whole life, but specifically in this hymn, or in this text that he writes, the events of Holy Week, his journey of suffering that ultimately ends, at least appears to end, right, in the tomb on Good Friday. And so I'm not really going to talk to you guys a lot about the text because I don't want this video to be like 10 minutes long, but I do want to point out that this text does in fact end in the tomb. Crossman writes this poem and it goes through the events of Holy Week and the things that Christ has done to show his great love for us. And it ends with Christ in the tomb that we deserve. And then at the end of the hymn, we sing that we could praise Christ forever for those great works of love that he does for us. Now, why would Crossman end with Christ in the tomb? Because we know there's more to come. And we know that there is an Easter that's going to happen a few days after that event of Christ's crucifixion, Christ being placed in the tomb. I don't know why Crossman wrote this poem. I don't know that he wrote it specifically for Lent. But he wrote it for a book of meditations or meditative poems. And so we can assume that he, in keeping with the themes of Lent, even if he's not writing specifically for Lent, is desiring for us to spend some time here setting aside willingly that Easter joy and focusing instead on the events that led up to that Easter joy and the suffering that Christ endured for our sake. And so that's why I think this tune or this hymn is so fitting for us as we are coming to the close of our Lenten season here. We know there's an Easter, but we spend this time here in Lent focusing on the events that occur beforehand. And when we focus on that, when we focus on our sin and we focus on the suffering that we were supposed to deserve, right, but that Christ takes for us instead, it makes that message that we're going to hear in the Easter hymns that are going to include the next step, right, the step that comes after the tomb, it makes that message so much sweeter for us to hear. And so I would pray that as we go throughout the rest of this season of Lent, Christ would continue to help us to remember his great love for us, his love unknown, that love that we can't even comprehend, and help us to focus on our sin and on his sacrifice, so that when we get to that moment of Easter, that joy is just so much sweeter for us. So we will see you guys in church on Sunday. Go to bed if you're not sleeping already.